It's the land of the Pilgrims and the perfect storm. Massachusetts. No other state has played such an important role in America's history. It was here where a band of settlers defined the aspirations of a nation, and where brave militiamen fought the first battles of the American Revolution. Aerial Massachusetts explores the tales of two cities. One hailed as the cradle of liberty, the other where 18 innocent women were condemned to hang. It was in this small northeastern state that fans suffered through the longest curse in sport history, and where 6 men famously set sail but never returned from the sea. From rolling hills that inspired one of America's most loved writers, to fields that are flooded every year to harvest colorful native berries. This is Massachusetts, the heart of New England. Henry David Thoreau once wrote of this wild coast, "A man may stand there and put all of America behind him." Massachusetts is not actually America's easternmost state. That honor belongs to Maine. But anyone on the Cape Cod National Seashore would never know the difference. This beach and the sea before it are as wild as it gets. It's a protected wilderness that stretches across 43,000 acres of pristine beaches, marshes, and ponds. The first inhabitants of this coast were Native Americans called the Wampanoag. They fished these waters that were rich with cod, sturgeon, and shellfish. On November 11th, 1620, a ship called the Mayflower rounded the tip of Cape Cod. On board were 102 passengers, pilgrims, servants, crew, and other laborers, all joined together to start an English colony in the New World. They first anchored here in what's now Provincetown Harbor. Today, Provincetown is a lively seaport. Its stunning views of the Atlantic have made it a haven for artists. But the Pilgrims saw this coast with a different eye. One of the Mayflower's passengers, William Bradford, who went on to become governor of the new colony, described the coast as a hideous and desolate wilderness. Ultimately, the Pilgrims didn't settle in Provincetown. They chose instead a more sheltered location just across Cape Cod Bay and named it Plymouth, after the English port from which they had departed 66 days earlier. A replica of the Mayflower lies in Plymouth Harbor and provides a glimpse of the cramped conditions on board for these 102 eager souls who traveled with their animals, tools, and weapons. Before heading to shore, the Pilgrims decided to establish new laws for their colony. All 41 men aboard stood on the ship's deck and signed a contract that's known as the Mayflower Compact. That contract is honored here at Plymouth's National Monument to the Forefathers. On the main pedestal stands the 36-foot-tall statue of Faith pointing towards the heavens. Seated below her are 4 figures representing the key principles of the Mayflower Compact: freedom, morality, law, and education. These virtues would become the foundation of America's democracy. The monument's inscription reads, "Erected by a grateful people in remembrance of their labors, sacrifices, and sufferings for the cause of civil and religious liberty." The Pilgrims' first settlement was built on land belonging to the Wampanoag. It's possible to imagine life in this early colony here on the Plymouth Plantation, a painstakingly researched recreation of the colonists' first village. The Pilgrims constructed modest timber-framed houses and raised livestock. Members of the Wampanoag helped the settlers try to survive, but during their first winter here, more than half of the Pilgrims died of diseases such as scurvy and pneumonia. They called this period the Great Sickness. After a disastrous start, new arrivals from England joined the survivors, and by 1627, the Plymouth colony was on the road to prosperity. But the Wampanoag weren't so lucky. Their hospitality was rewarded with plague. European diseases ended up wiping out 2/3 of the tribe. The story goes that it was here in 1621 that the Pilgrims held the first Thanksgiving. But long before then, Native Americans had celebrated successful harvests of their own with annual feasts. The Pilgrim celebration likely didn't happen in late November, but earlier in the fall, when they harvested their crops of corn, barley, and peas. It is said that a Wampanoag chief turned up to celebrate too, with 5 freshly killed deer and 90 men. More than 200 years later, in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln officially made Thanksgiving a national holiday. The Pilgrims weren't the only band of English settlers to seek freedom in Massachusetts. In 1630, a second group arrived. They called themselves Puritans, after their wish to purify the English church. They disembarked in a sheltered harbor to the north and started to build what John Winthrop, future governor of the new colony, called a city on a hill, one that they hoped the world would admire. That city is now Boston, a metropolis of more than 4.5 million people. Just as it was for the Pilgrims, education was a guiding principle for Boston's founders. Just 5 years after the Puritans arrived, they established Boston Latin School. It is now the oldest public school in America and among the best high schools in the country. 4 presidents of Harvard are among its graduates, along with 4 governors of Massachusetts and 4 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, including John Hancock and Samuel Adams. But it's the institutions of higher learning in and around Boston that are best known. America's oldest university lies just across the Charles River in Cambridge. Harvard University dates from 1636, just 15 years after the Pilgrims landed. It was founded when English pastor John Harvard left half his wealth and a private library of 400 books to start a college. Those 400 books have grown to over 15 million, giving Harvard the largest academic library in the world. One of Harvard's most famous former students is actor Matt Damon, who was also raised right here in Cambridge. Damon never graduated from Harvard. His breakthrough film, Good Will Hunting, was shot on the campus of nearby Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In the film, Damon plays a math prodigy who worked here on the MIT campus as a janitor. MIT has been one of the world's premier research institutions ever since it was founded in 1861 and holds nearly 1,000 patents. But one of the greatest inventions of all time was developed by a professor at nearby Boston University, just across the Charles River. In the 1870s, when Alexander Graham Bell was a professor of vocal physiology, the BU campus was just a fraction of the size it is today. In his spare time, Bell tinkered at home and in a small rented lab, developing devices for the hearing impaired. In 1871, he finished work on what he called the electrical speech machine, better known today as the telephone. With its long tradition of learning and more than 100 colleges and universities, Boston has been called the Athens of America. But one of the best places to study American history is right here on Boston's streets. A walking path called the Freedom Trail winds past many of the city's most important historic sites. The trail begins here at Boston Common, America's first public park, and a site that's played many different roles in the city's history. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, cattle grazed freely on the green, and it was used for public hangings. Further down the trail is the Old State House. Now surrounded by modern office buildings, this 1713 structure is Boston's oldest remaining public building. It was here on July 18, 1776, that the Declaration of Independence was read from the building's balcony. It was the first public reading of the document in the city that had sown the seeds of America's freedom. A new State House was built in 1789, but just 3 years later, its wooden dome started to leak. So the city hired a local silversmith named Paul Revere to cover it with copper instead. The new Massachusetts State House is built on land once owned by John Hancock, Massachusetts' first elected governor. The Freedom Trail continues to the Old South Meeting House. It was here where Boston's famous Tea Party got started. Built in 1729, this was at one time Boston's largest building. Colonists often gathered here to voice their frustration with British rule. On December 16, 1773, a heated debate erupted inside over the British tax on tea. Later that night, about 50 men, badly disguised as Native Americans, gathered at Griffin's Wharf in Boston Harbor. They boarded ships and dumped 350 chests of tea into the water. This rebellious act was a key event that helped spur the American Revolution. The British responded by closing the harbor and attempting to suppress the colonial economy. But political tensions in Boston would soon reach their boiling point. Boston's Freedom Trail continues north across the Charles River to the USS Constitution, the oldest warship in the world that is still on active duty. At the end of the 18th century, Boston Harbor bustled with cargo ships from around the world. But pirates off the coast of Africa were a constant threat to these vessels and their crews, just as they can be to freighters today. Built in 1798 in a Boston shipyard, the Constitution was able to outfight vessels its own size and outrun even larger ones. In a battle during the War of 1812, British cannonballs bounced off its thick oak hull, giving the Constitution its nickname, Old Ironsides. Nearby lies a modern ship with a colorful past. It wasn't pirates that threatened this destroyer, but kamikaze pilots. The 2,000-ton USS Cassin Young first set out in combat in 1944. With its torpedoes, depth charges, and anti-aircraft guns, it was built to play an important role in the naval offensive against the Japanese. On July 30th, 1945, a kamikaze pilot crashed into the destroyer near its main smokestack. An explosion killed 22 men and nearly crippled the vessel. But the Cassin Young and its crew made it safely back to the U.S. The ship was finally decommissioned in 1974. Just as in colonial days, Boston remains a thriving, vibrant city. Nicknamed a city of neighborhoods, each part of town has its own rich history and flavor. Today, Boston's Back Bay is one of the city's most distinguished enclaves, but it had humble beginnings. The land on which it was built was once a swamp. When city planners decided to develop the area in the late 19th century, they mapped out a design for a series of similar brownstones, which, more than a century later, are some of the most desired houses in town. Soaring above these row houses is the tallest building in Boston and in all of New England. The 60-story John Hancock Tower was built in 1976 with 10,000 panes of blue mirrored glass that have made it a Boston icon. But once, it was the embarrassment of the city. Soon after it was built, strong winds ripped out many of the building's 500-pound window panes, which crashed on the sidewalks below. Amazingly, no one was injured. All of the building's glass had to be replaced at a cost of $8 million. When Irish immigrants arrived in Boston in the early 19th century, many settled here in a South Boston working-class neighborhood known as Southie. Jutting out into Dorchester Bay, it was also the heart of the city's shipping industry. By the 1950s, it had fallen on hard times, but since then, it's had a renaissance. Thanks to the neighborhood's proximity to downtown, its old 3-story wooden houses have become highly sought after. And the movies Good Will Hunting and The Departed, which were shot here, have helped put Southie on the map. Guarding the harbor is Southie's Castle Island. There's been a fort on this site since 1634. Today, Fort Independence still stands. Built between 1834 and 1851, it's the 8th fort to occupy this spot. Although forts here were used during the Civil War and both World Wars, they saw little action. And Fort Independence is best remembered today for its literary association. A local legend says that in 1817, after a duel, a lieutenant here named Gustavus Drane was locked up in a vault to perish. 10 years later, Edgar Allan Poe was stationed at the fort. Locals like to think that Drane's story was the inspiration for Poe's strikingly similar tale, The Cask of Amontillado. With its narrow streets and elegant Federal-style homes, Beacon Hill is one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods. It also has some cozy pubs. But there's only one where everybody knows your name. This may be the most famous bar in all of Boston, the Bull and Finch Pub. Thanks to the television show Cheers, tourists have been flocking here for years. Unfortunately, they won't find any of the show's regulars inside. The bar's interior was a Hollywood fabrication. Across town, there's another place with bright lights and larger-than-life characters. But this time, they're real. Fenway Park is home to the Boston Red Sox. Built in 1912, it's the oldest Major League stadium in America still in use. The Red Sox were among the most successful teams in baseball. Then, in 1919, the team sold their star player, Babe Ruth, nicknamed the Bambino, to the New York Yankees. The Sox then entered the longest shutout in professional baseball, 86 years without a World Series win. The losing streak was known as the Curse of the Bambino. The curse wasn't removed until 2004, when the Red Sox finally won the World Series. The Massachusetts Turnpike runs right next to Fenway Park, on its way into the center of the city. For decades, Boston's transportation network was plagued by poor infrastructure. 2 major state highways ran right through downtown, creating some of the worst traffic congestion in the country. To solve these problems, the city spent 30 years and more than $15 billion to construct bridges and an underground 8-lane tunnel. Called the Big Dig, it was one of the largest and most technologically challenging highway projects in U.S. history. But the project was stricken with billion-dollar overruns, leaks, death, and criminal arrests. When it was finally completed in 2006, millions in Boston breathed a sigh of relief. One of the Big Dig's most visible projects is the Leonard P. Zakim Bunker Hill Bridge, one of the widest cable-stayed bridges in the world. Its cables appear as a giant ship under sail, paying tribute to Boston's maritime past. The bridge opened in 2002 with an extraordinary publicity stunt. 14 elephants from the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus crossed the span to demonstrate its strength. A test similar to one done a century earlier on New York's Brooklyn Bridge. The bridge leads to Charlestown, site of the Old North Church, the oldest standing church in Boston and one of America's most historic sites. In 1775, the British decided to confiscate militia weapons in the town of Concord, outside of Boston. Paul Revere had made plans to use this church tower to signal to others how the British planned to attack. One lantern meant they would be leaving Boston by land, two if by sea. On the evening of April 18th, Revere ordered the signalman to light 2 lanterns. Then he left to spread the word himself on his legendary midnight ride. As news of the impending attack spread, farmers grabbed their muskets and prepared for battle. The first place they would have to make a stand was here at Lexington. This statue celebrates the man who commanded Lexington's militia, John Parker. Parker's militia assembled here on Lexington Green. But when Parker realized that he and his men were outnumbered, he ordered them to retreat. Then, a shot rang out, igniting the first battle of the American Revolution. To this day, no one knows for sure which side pulled the trigger. When the fighting was over, 8 rebels were dead and the Redcoats were marching on. By the time they reached Concord, a second force of militiamen was waiting here on the North Bridge. A lengthy battle ensued, during which the colonists chased the Redcoats all the way back to Boston and inflicted heavy damage. By the time the Redcoats reached safety, 1 in 6 was killed, wounded, or missing. So pivotal was the colonists' victory that Ralph Waldo Emerson immortalized this bridge in his famous poem, Concord Hymn. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Emerson knew Concord well. He lived here, directly across the street from 2 other literary giants of the 19th century. This quiet house, known as the Wayside, was the childhood home of Louisa May Alcott. Her life here partly inspired scenes in her American classic, Little Women. The Alcotts later sold the Wayside to Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote his final books here. Alcott, Hawthorne, and Emerson were all buried in Concord's Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, along with their friend and colleague, Henry David Thoreau. In 1845, the 28-year-old Thoreau built himself a 1-room cabin here in Concord, right next to Walden Pond. Thoreau lived and wrote here for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. His book, On Walden Pond, was an indictment of materialism, a guide to fulfillment, and an ode to nature. Thoreau wrote, "I never found a companion that was so companionable as solitude." By the 1990s, the woods surrounding Walden Pond were threatened by development. But Don Henley, frontman for the rock band The Eagles, stepped in and formed the Walden Woods Project, which is actively protecting the pond and honors Thoreau's legacy of conservation and social responsibility. 2 centuries before Thoreau, and just 30 miles to the east, a band of Puritan settlers chose the mouth of the Nomkeg River as their sheltered land. They named it Salem, a distortion of Shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. A statue of Roger Conant, the town's founder, stands on historic Salem Common. Today, the streets of Salem appear peaceful, quiet. Children celebrate Halloween in a local park. But more than 3 centuries ago, Salem was anything but peaceful. At the end of the 17th century, the Massachusetts town of Salem was in a state of heightened anxiety. The threat of Indian attacks, internal religious dissent, a smallpox epidemic, and a strong belief in the devil caused fear and distrust to spread like wildfire throughout this Puritan community. Salem's popular Witch Museum tells the terrifying events that followed. It all happened when 2 young girls in the village became ill with violent fits. Doctors diagnosed them as bewitched, and the girls accused 3 local women of witchcraft. Soon, hysteria took over. 160 men and women were accused of being witches and brought to trial. Known today as the Witch House, this was once home of Judge Jonathan Corwin, the local magistrate who investigated the claims of witchcraft and ultimately sent 19 innocent men and women to their deaths. 18 of them were hanged on a nearby hill. Salem's witch trials mark one of the darkest periods in American history. By the 18th century, Salem had grown into one of the most important seaports in America. The city grew rich on the codfish trade with the West Indies and Europe. Much of its wealth passed through the Salem Customs House, where taxes were collected on imported cargo. It was here where American author Nathaniel Hawthorne had a 3-year stint as a customs official, work which inspired part of his American classic, The Scarlet Letter. While ship owners in Salem grew rich from international trade, life for New England sailors came with great risk. And still does today. No other town has known the dangers of the sea like nearby Gloucester. It was from this bustling commercial fishing port on September 20th, 1991, that the 72-foot Andrea Gale and her 6-man crew set off to fish the Outer Banks. They were 180 miles off the coast and on their way home when they were hit by one of the worst storms on record. The ship and its crew were lost at sea. But their story was captured in the best-selling book and movie, The Perfect Storm. And they weren't Gloucester's first lost sailors. On the city's seafront stands the Man at the Wheel statue, built in 1923 to commemorate 300 years of seafaring. The 8-foot-tall statue includes the names of hundreds of others who set sail from here but never returned. Gloucester's fishermen follow in a tradition that dates back to the 18th century, when the city was crowned the shipbuilding capital of New England. The first American schooner was reportedly built here in 1713. With their multiple masts, abilities to reach high speeds and sail windward, schooners were perfect vessels for fishing and privateering. Today, a 65-foot modern schooner can be chartered from Gloucester Harbor. The Thomas E. Lannon was the brainchild of a man who'd heard stories of his grandfather's exploits at sea. The schooner he now owns is modeled on boats from the turn of the 20th century and was built by a designer whose family has been in the shipbuilding business since 1650. But Massachusetts wasn't built on shipbuilding alone. The old mill town of Lowell was named for an industrial pioneer who helped give birth to Massachusetts and America's industrial age. Lowell lies on the Merrimack River, where it flows across the Pawtucket Falls. In the days before steam engines, falling water was the best means to power a mill. In 1810, a man named Francis Lowell returned from a trip to Britain armed with details of the workings of the power loom, a cornerstone of England's industrial success. Lowell and his partners then built a mill of their own to turn cotton into thread and thread into cloth, all under one roof. After his death, the new mill town of Lowell was established and named in his honor. Here, nearly 6 miles of canals powered 40 mills that turned out 50,000 miles of cloth a year. These mills and others throughout New England were the birth of mass production in America. Being able to produce cloth from scratch in a single factory was so revolutionary at the time. Many, including Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, and Charles Dickens, came to marvel at Lowell's mills. To the west, in Amherst, lies a house nestled in trees. This was the birthplace of Emily Dickinson, one of America's most loved poets. She spent much of her life here in a house known as the Homestead. Its secluded location was a welcome escape for the intensely private Dickinson. She had her own writing room on the second floor, where she composed more than 1,100 poems, all by the time she was just 35. But little of her work was published during her lifetime. The few poems that appeared in newspapers were printed anonymously and without her permission. Just 25 miles south of Amherst lies Springfield, the birthplace of one of the greatest sports of all time, honored here at the Basketball Hall of Fame. In 1891, James Naismith, a sports teacher, set out to create a diversion for his unruly students during a long New England winter. He came up with the idea of shooting a soccer ball at a peach basket positioned 10 feet off the ground. The first formal rules for basketball were created the next year. But it was a full decade before a real game changer was introduced: open-bottomed baskets, so that players didn't have to manually retrieve the ball. Since the days of Naismith's early basketball games, Springfield has become the third largest city in Massachusetts. But just 40 miles west of here is one of the most stunning natural landscapes in New England. These are the rolling hills and forests of the Berkshires. During the 19th century, these hills were stripped of trees to feed the factories and towns of industrial Massachusetts. But they've bounced back. Thousands come here every year to witness one of New England's greatest events: fall foliage. The towns and villages of the Berkshires can seem to disappear under a blanket of leaves. That's because there are more than 15,000 acres of protected forests here. At the heart of the Berkshires lies Stockbridge. It was originally settled in the mid-1730s as a mission town for the Stockbridge Indian tribe, who had been forced out of their homeland in New York State. At the center of town is the old Red Lion Inn, which has operated continuously since 1733. Stockbridge is also home to a very unusual burial site. Theodore Sedgwick, a state Supreme Court justice, created a private burial plot here for himself and his family. It's known locally as the Sedgwick Pie. Unlike most graves which face the east, these are arranged in a concentric circle. Legend has it that Sedgwick wanted to be sure that on Judgment Day, when the family rose from their graves, they would all be facing each other. Less than 10 miles north of Stockbridge lies Lenox, once home to the first woman ever to receive a Pulitzer Prize for literature. In 1902, Edith Wharton designed and built an elaborate estate here, known as the Mount. The house was her chance to express the ideas she outlined in the best-selling book, The Decoration of Houses. She wrote of her new house: "On a slope overlooking the dark waters and densely wooded shores of Laurel Lake, we built a spacious and dignified house, to which we gave the name of my great-grandfather's place, the Mount." Wharton also personally designed the estate's elaborate grounds, including a formal walled Italian garden. It is one of just a few National Historic Landmarks that are dedicated to women. The Berkshires forests and hills head north, right up to the base of the state's highest peak, Mount Greylock reaches almost 3,500 feet and is surrounded by the Mount Greylock State Reservation. Created in 1898, it was the first park in the state of Massachusetts. And in 1932, the peak was crowned by the Massachusetts Veterans War Memorial. Built to resemble a lighthouse, its beacon is powerful enough to be seen 70 miles away. There is no shortage of real lighthouses in Massachusetts. 61 of them are perched along the state's 1,500 miles of coastline. One of the oldest, Gay Head Light, lies on one of Massachusetts' Great Islands. Martha's Vineyard is located just off Cape Cod. This island was once called Nopi, meaning amid the water, by Wampanoag Native Americans who have lived here for more than 10,000 years. The Gay Head Light stands guard over one of the most breathtaking sights in the state, the Aquina Cliffs. Each colorful stratum in the 150 feet of sediment tells an ancient tale from 100 million years ago. Nestled into these layers of sand, clay, and gravel are the fossilized remains of ancient sharks, wild horses, and even whale bones dating back millennia. Martha's Vineyard's beaches and seaside cottages have drawn summer residents here for centuries. Ferries, which started running here as early as 1818, now bring more than 100,000 visitors every summer. Over the years, they've included many prominent artists and intellectuals, such as Carly Simon, James Taylor, James Cagney, and Martin Luther King Jr. The island's isolation has made it the chosen vacation spot for presidents too, including Obama and Clinton. But Martha's Vineyard has also known great tragedy. On July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. was on his way here when he lost control of his single-engine plane and crashed into the Atlantic. He, his wife Carolyn, and his sister-in-law all died in the crash. Their ashes were spread in the waters off the island's coast. Martha's Vineyard's coastline stretches almost 124 miles, covering two islands, one known locally as the Vineyard, and the smaller Chappaquiddick Island, just off the main island's eastern tip. Many know the Vineyard's coastline from the movie Jaws. During filming, director Steven Spielberg paid local kids $5 a day to run screaming from the water whenever the mechanical shark would approach the island shore. Although Jaws turned out to be a blockbuster hit in the summer of 1975, there actually has not been a great white shark attack in Massachusetts waters since 1936. But there is reason for beachgoers to be wary. Nearby is the hunting ground of great whites. Massachusetts' Muskeget Island is a tiny piece of land. Low sandbars and shoals make it dangerous for most boats, but provide a perfect breeding ground for gray seals. As many as 2,000 seal pups are born here every year, and the pups are perfect food for great white sharks. Once great whites reach 1,000 pounds, they abandon their fish diet and start hunting seals. Less than 10 miles from Muskeget shores lies the second of Massachusetts' Great Islands, Nantucket. It's the only place in North America to have the same name for a town, county, and island. The name Nantucket is thought to come from a Native American word meaning faraway island. In the late 17th century, Nantucket's unexploited waters were overflowing with whales. Legend has it that one of the island settlers looked out upon the whale-filled waters and remarked, "This is a green field in which we will go to prosper." Native American tribes had long been harvesting beached whales well before Europeans arrived. But in 1690, the island settlers hired a Cape Cod man named Ichabod Paddock to teach them how to whale. By the late 19th century, Nantucket was the third largest city in Massachusetts, with a population of 10,000. As the whaling industry expanded in the 19th century, larger whaling ships were needed to voyage through faraway waters. And this Massachusetts harbor town, New Bedford, was perfectly poised to accommodate the industry's growth. The town, conveniently located in the steady winds of Buzzards Bay, had the infrastructure for a successful port, shipyards, a large workforce, and access to New York and Boston via railroads. By 1823, the small town sent out more whaling ships than Nantucket. Eventually, New Bedford had become the greatest whaling city of the 19th century. During New Bedford's glory days, a young 21-year-old came to the prosperous city looking for work on a whale ship. His name was Herman Melville, and his experiences inspired the literary classic Moby Dick. But before leaving on his first long, dangerous voyage, Melville attended services in this chapel, known as the Seaman's Bethel. For 3 years, he sailed the South Seas aboard the vessel Acushnet. He published his lengthy novel in 1851, but it received poor reviews. And 40 years later, he died in obscurity. But within 3 decades after his death, Moby Dick was considered a masterpiece. By the end of the 1850s, the whaling industry was in decline. New Bedford sent out its last whaling ship in 1925. In 1850, the average length of a whaling voyage was 42 months. This long time at sea brought about many diseases. One of the worst was scurvy. To ward off this potentially deadly disease, whaling ships carried a Massachusetts staple, the cranberry, which is rich with vitamin C. They are still grown right here on Cape Cod. There is nothing like watching a cranberry harvest from the air. This red fruit grows on small shrubs, but they're not harvested like most nuts or berries. Every autumn, the cranberry fields are flooded. Then farmers use machines called beaters to loosen the berries. They need to be careful not to harm the bushes themselves and endanger the next year's crop. Once the cranberries are floating on the surface, they are gathered with a boom and then processed. A single boom can collect cranberries from one entire field, creating a unique palette of colors and shapes that are best seen from high above. Today, Massachusetts produces 1/3 of all cranberries grown in America, second only to Wisconsin. It is the state's official berry. Alongside Cape Cod's cranberry bogs is the town of Hyannisport. In 1926, Joseph Kennedy Sr. rented a clapboard cottage here and liked it so much, he bought the place 2 years later. Over the next 3 decades, his sons, John and Robert, purchased houses on the same block. Each Kennedy home is a fine example of typical Cape Cod architecture. Simple white-frame clapboard houses with central fireplaces. Many view this compound as the holy site of democratic politics. It was here where the Kennedy family watched JFK clinch the presidential victory over Nixon in 1960. It was also where John's brother Ted spent his final days before dying of a brain tumor in 2009. He had served as a Massachusetts senator for 47 years. One of the family's greatest legacies is the Cape Cod National Seashore. Created by President John F. Kennedy in 1961, to preserve the land of the Pilgrims and the native inhabitants who first lived along these shores. This is Massachusetts, the birthplace of America's independence and the heart of New England.